The U.S. is planning to provide Ukraine with cluster munitions to help it in the war with Russia, U.S. officials told Reuters on Thursday. The move, if confirmed, would provide a powerful new element to Kiev's counteroffensive, but it has already drawn opposition from human rights groups who say the weapon kills indiscriminately. The White House said sending cluster munitions to Ukraine is, quote, under active consideration, but it had no announcement to make. President Joe Biden is due to attend a NATO summit in Lithuania next week, with the conflict likely to dominate discussions. Ahead of the gathering, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has been drumming up support for his country's bid to become a member of the Defense Alliance. He used a trip to the Czech Republic on Thursday to urge NATO countries to stand up to Russia.
Some people still look back at Moscow. Some people are afraid of Russia. Although I believe that this is a great moment, a great chance to show the courage of the entire alliance and the strength of the alliance. But nevertheless, we are talking about a clear signal, some concrete things in the direction of an invitation. We need this motivation. We need honesty in our relations.
Zelensky's plea received support from Czech President Pavel.
Here it should be made absolutely clear that it is in the interest of the Czech Republic that Ukraine, as soon as the war is over, should start negotiations on joining NATO, because it is also in the interest of our security, regional stability, and economic prosperity.
Ukraine wants to join NATO as quickly as possible, but member states have been divided over how fast that step should be taken. Some are worried the move will take the alliance closer to an active war with Russia. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian city of Lviv remains devastated after a Russian missile hit a residential building there, killing at least 7 people. Officials said much of the rubble left by Thursday's attack had been cleared. Since Russia's invasion in February last year, thousands have fled to Lviv, a city far from the front lines. Ukrainian officials slammed the attack, while Moscow claimed it targeted troop bases, not civilians.
First, we base our security assistance decision on Ukraine's needs on the ground. And Ukraine needs artillery to sustain its offensive and defensive operations. Second, Russia has been using cluster munitions since the start of this war to attack Ukraine. Russia's been using cluster munitions with high dud or failure rates of between 30 and 40%. In this environment, Ukraine has been requesting cluster munitions in order to defend its own sovereign territory. The cluster munitions that we would provide have dud rates far below what Russia is providing, not higher than 2.5%. And third, we are closely coordinating with Ukraine as it has requested these munitions. Ukraine is committed to post-conflict demining efforts to mitigate any potential harm to civilians, and this will be necessary regardless of whether the United States provides these munitions or not, because of Russia's widespread use of cluster munition.
The United States is making the controversial move of sending Ukraine cluster munitions for its counteroffensive against occupying Russian forces. White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan defended the decision, announced on Friday.
We recognize that cluster munitions create a risk of civilian harm from unexploded ordnance. This is why we've deferred the decision for as long as we could. But there is also a massive risk of civilian harm if Russian troops and tanks roll over Ukrainian positions and take more Ukrainian territory and subjugate more Ukrainian civilians because Ukraine does not have enough artillery.
Cluster munitions are widely banned around the world. They typically release large numbers of smaller bomblets that can kill indiscriminately over a large area. Those that fail to explode pose a danger for decades after a conflict ends. Rights groups and the United Nations Secretary General questioned Washington's decision on the munitions. Ukraine has asked for the weapon and said the move would have, quote, an extraordinary psycho-emotional impact on Russian forces. According to the White House, the country has provided written assurances for the careful use of the weapon to minimize risk to civilians.
Ukraine is committed to post-conflict demining efforts to mitigate any potential harm to civilians, and this will be necessary regardless of whether the United States provides these munitions or not, because of Russia's widespread use of cluster munitions.
It's part of an $800 million security package that brings the total U.S. military aid to Ukraine to more than $40 billion since Russia invaded the country in February 2022. Russian President Vladimir Putin, who claims the conflict aims to protect Russian security, has accused the U.S. and its allies of fighting an expanding proxy war.
Russia has been using cluster munitions indiscriminately since the start of this war in order to attack Ukraine. By contrast, Ukraine is seeking DPICM rounds in order to defend its own sovereign territory. Second, compared to Russian cluster munitions, the DPICM rounds we will provide Ukraine have an extremely low failure or dud rate. The DPICM ammunition we are delivering to Ukraine will consist only of those with a dud rate less than 2.35%. Third, we're working with Ukraine to minimize the risks associated with the decision. The Ukrainian government has offered us assurances in writing on the responsible use of DPICMs, including that they will not use the rounds in civilian-populated urban environments, and that they will record where they use these rounds, which will simplify later demining efforts.
Dr. Call, I have two quick questions on the cluster munition and one on Russia. On the cluster munition, you mentioned five.
Are we breaking the law? We are not breaking the law. I would say, first of all, the prohibition against exporting above 1%, these munitions are pretty close to 1%, but they're not at the 1% level. But the president does have the authority to waive that requirement on national security grounds, and that's what he has done in this instance. There's no dispute that he has that authority. It's in law.
Absorb that kind of training and apply it in this kind of difficult battlefield situation.
I'm as concerned about the humanitarian circumstance as anybody. But the worst thing for civilians in Ukraine is for Russia to win the war. And so it's important that they don't. There are a number of models below the dud rate of 2.35%.
Here we go.
Well, the UK is signatory to a convention which prohibits the production or use of cluster munitions and discourages their use. We will continue to do our part to support Ukraine against Russia's illegal and unprovoked invasion. We've done that by providing heavy battle tanks and most recently long-range weapons, and hopefully all countries can continue to support Ukraine. Russia's act of barbarism is causing untold suffering to millions of people. It's right that we collectively stand up to it, and I'll be heading off to the NATO summit next week in Vilnius, where we will be discussing exactly this with our allies, how we can strengthen our support for Ukraine.
No such thing as a game-changing weapon. We keep hoping that there's some munition or some weapon that we can provide the Ukrainians that will produce victory. You hear that back when there were discussions on Patriot, when there were discussions about tanks, and discussions about F-16s, and now cluster munitions. U.S. inventories of other munitions are already very low. We've given about as much as we can, so there really isn't an alternative out there now. But the other one is that these munitions are just very effective, much more effective than regular artillery against certain kinds of targets. And now with the Ukrainian offensive not doing as well as people had hoped, they need a boost, and this could provide that boost. Well, what the Ukrainians have to do is to be careful where they use these weapons and to avoid using them in villages, for example, because you also get very high dud rates in built-up areas. They're much better in open areas. So I would hope that insight, that targeting advice has gone along.